So I'm here today with Steve Darby, a local preacher from the Somerset Mendip circuit, who is about to celebrate 60 years of local preaching. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much, David.
Steve, I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about how did you get into local preaching in the first place?
Right, okay. Well, if I go back to my mid-teenage years, I joined a Methodist youth club in East London, and it was wonderful. You know, there was a big crowd of young people, and our minister at the time, it was the time of the Billy Graham appeal thing, and he followed that suit, and he used to make appeals for you to come down to the front if you wanted to give your life to Jesus.
Okay.
And my background was such that I thought, yeah, I know where all this has been, because I'd been at a Pentecostal Sunday school. And I actually made that decision, and I can pin it down to a date. 3rd of April 1960, where I went down. He found that, because he'd heard me in church, that I was good at reading. You know, he said, "You're reading exceptionally well. Have you ever thought about local preaching?" Well, I hadn't, but we had a group of young people, and the minister formed what he called a mission band, and it was about a dozen young people, and I mean young. I was probably the oldest as a mid-teenager, and we used to go around to Methodist churches and lead the worship. And I was always asked to preach the sermon, and that's where it all kicked off, really. And a number of people said to me, "Have you ever thought, about local preaching?" In fact, one or two even said, "Have you ever thought about the ministry?" Which I hadn't got that far at all with. But that was how it started, and I began my 4 years training period, going around churches and learning as I went along and reading. That's it.
And how did you feel in those early years? Was this something that you took to like a duck to water, or?
Yes, if I don't want that to sound arrogant,
Not at all.
because I can remember one of the great honours at my school, my secondary school. We used to have school assemblies, and you were always looked out for somebody to do the reading in the assembly. And I did it a couple of times, because again I got this feedback. People say, "You do that really well," and I felt great. Consequently, if I'm given a choice between doing an interview or something, or speaking to a crowd of 50,000 in the Royal Albert Hall, put me up for Albert Hall, please. Because in answer to your question, I've always felt comfortable and felt that it was worth my while doing it,
Absolutely. So, thinking around the 60 years of your preaching journey, are there any particular moments or services that particularly stand out for you?
Yes, there are. There was one thing that I'm not sure whether, yes, I suppose I would call it a service, but it was back in the 70s, and Methodism had the MAYC, Methodist Association of Youth Clubs, weekend at the Royal Albert Hall, and we had a little music group, a bit like the one we've got at Castle Kerry, and I asked the organisers if they'd like to come and hear us at our rehearsal. Net result was that we were invited to play the music for the service that was at the Royal Albert Hall, and got the photographs, got the T-shirt, when I did it.
That's amazing.
It's hard to say, because there have been some where I've been very moved, and people have been very generous and kind to me and encouraged me. But to sort of actually pick out one, it is quite difficult.
So, how would you feel that your sort of personal faith has changed and developed over this time? Have there been any significant shifts, or any things that you've sort of come to have revelation about during this during the 60 years?
Yes, from making my decision back in 1960, that was a culmination of my religious teaching up to that point. My first spiritual teachers were Anglican nuns, would you believe? And then I went to a Pentecostal church, wonderful Pentecostal church, where I came under the influence of some tremendous teachers, tremendous people. And I became conscious that something was happening. And when that night in April 1960, when that occurred, I can definitely say, I can say hand on heart, I am convinced that God spoke to me. And it was the beginning of the journey of training to be a local preacher. But it was more than that. It was about Jesus living in my life. And some pretty incredible things have happened over that period, you know, in life, you know.
Yes. The church was a very different place, perhaps, in the 60s than it is now. You know, the church has evolved and changed as society has evolved and changed. You know, it's made some big decisions in terms of how the church is run and how we interpret scripture and such things over that time. I'm just wondering whether any of that you know, has particularly affected you and your preaching and how you've gone about that.
I love the fellowship of the church. I've got a good picture here. I don't know whether you want to see it there, but and the reason I'm showing you that is that was in 1956, and look at the numbers. You know, it was packed. So I grew up with.
We'll just show this to the camera. There we are.
I grew up in a church, in the Methodist church, where I say I went to the youth club there, which was fabulous, and we had good preaching. Yeah, it was evangelical, but it touched me, and I've learned through it. And I've said that. I don't know whether this is blasphemy or not, but I don't always follow the recommended readings for the service that I'm taking. I have found that in my preaching, usually if things are happening in my life that are speaking to me, maybe a passage of scripture, maybe a book, maybe a meeting, maybe all sorts of things, and I can look at that and say, I think God's telling me to say something here. And I have found that my preaching has gone on those lines. In the early days, I followed the example of the minister that was responsible for my conversion, and I would say now, you know, if folk want to come forward and make a commitment, you know, here's the moment and such. I haven't done that for a long time, because of the books I've read and people I've met. One of the things I did love, I used to work in London, and on Wednesdays in central London, there was a thing called Tower Hill at 12:30, and it was conducted by the Reverend Donald Soper, who was a politician and a wonderful man. And I remember how it was. He used to stand on a wall and he'd talk and answer questions on any sort of subject, you know, spiritual. And I was so impressed. And that lifted me a level up. Because if you turn and think, right, I've started off, you know, and I'm doing evangelical work and such, I started reading Donald Soper's books. I thought, oh, this like is, and one of my cherished memories is when he'd finished speaking to this crowd of quite hostile people. I went up and I said, excuse me, Lord Soper. He said, yes. I said, I've just read your book Tower Hill at 12:30, and although I'm not clever enough to understand all the points that you made, I was blessed by the ones that I didn't understand. And I'll never forget, he put his hand out, shook my hand, he said, oh, God bless you, my boy. And I've cherished that, all that stuff. But what I'm saying here is that the journey carried on. You know, I started with the Anglican nuns, I'd gone through the Pentecostal, I'd come into Methodism and moved on. I'd become a local preacher, and I was moving on from the style of worship that I began with into something that was more personal from my experience.
And you're still learning now?
All the time.
Okay.
all the time.
So you mentioned Donald Soper.
Yeah.
Who else would you say has sort of influenced you on that journey over the years?
Well, Donald Soper would be the most well-known one. I have great regard for Cliff Richard.
Mhm.
You know, the guy came out and said he was a Christian when, at a time when, what did you know? Come out and say that when you're a rock and roll star. So that was fun. But I have to be honest that the people who've been the biggest influence of me have been the people I've rubbed shoulders with. People in the congregations where I've worshipped, where I still worship. There are people who teach me new things. I consider myself blessed because I've come under the influence of some terrific ministers and some terrific preachers, lay preachers. But the ones that have impressed me most have usually been the people, the ministers that I'd served under.
Because you had that relationship with them.
It was there.
Yes.
I like relationships,
Absolutely. Yes.
You know,
yes.
yeah.
So you obviously started your preaching journey at quite a young age.
Yeah.
In relative terms.
Yes.
And thinking about the church now, the young people who you know, and perhaps the wider sense of young people throughout the connection. What advice would somebody like yourself want to give to the emerging generation of church thinkers, church leaders, church preachers?
Yeah, what I found, you know, my wife and I, when we were still in London, we became leaders of the Sunday school and leaders of the youth club that I had joined, and we still are in touch with about half a dozen of them. You know, and you know, they've been here and they can come and see you. So I'm thinking, well, that's lovely. And I try very hard in our fellowship. We're blessed again with some lovely young people, and I like to make a relationship and connection with them. I did one of them. You might want to squeeze this one out, but one of the lads, lovely chap, and whenever we had coffee after church, he was always at the biscuits, and he took loads of them. And I referred to him once as the Biscuit Bandit. I got a letter from him about a year or two ago, and he'd heard me and preaching, and he came and visited the church, and I was preaching, and he came back with a theological question, and he said, "What do you think about?" and put it down. And what was so thrilling is that he signed it off. He didn't sign it off
With his name.
He signed it off the Biscuit Bandit. And I think there's something there. There's a connection with them. When we see each other.
What would you say are the biggest kind of lessons that you've learned through these 60 years in terms of either about yourself or about the church or about life? You know, we've mentioned this is a long and continuing journey.
Yeah.
You know, what are the take homes? What you know, what do you feel that this 60 years of learning has brought for you?
Yeah, I can look over that time, and I can go back a long way, and I can see things that have happened to me in life that have brought me great joy. I've seen things that have happened to me in life that have brought challenge. I've seen things in life that have been difficult and such. But you use the word journey, and that's what I find. I find that in my prayers now, that I usually start with a period of reflection and look back, and I think of all the people, you know, that have had an influence on me, and all the people that I've kept in touch with, and they keep in touch with me, and I can look at situations and think there was no doubt whatsoever that God was at work in there. I'll just share one story with you. That when I was in London, and I was in my late 30s, and I was working for a bank, a branch in London, and the manager, this is going out, he was dreadful. He was incompetent. And I'd just spent 3 years working for the bank's training centre, and I'd worked under the finest management I'd known in commerce, and that was a clash. And I remember I'd only been 3 months at this new branch, and I came home to Anne. I said, I can't do it. She said, what do you mean? I said, I can't work under that bloke. I'm going to resign. And I started the process of complaining about the way this manager wasn't complying with what we've been teaching in the bank's training course and such. And I joined the trade union. I never thought I'd do that. But I felt so strongly that we were being called, and we felt an affinity for Somerset because Anna's got family connections. But what I do recall was that when I had a meeting with the trade union representative, we sat down and I spoke to him about all of this and shared my feelings, the whys and the wherefores. When we finished, he said, okay, he said, I'm going to take this forward to higher echelons and such. And then the most amazing thing, he turned and said, would you like me to pray for you? Trade union guy was a Christian. Now, you know, people will turn and say, oh, well, that was just a coincidence. No, it wasn't. I don't know. I've seen things happen in my life where I've looked and I've been undoubtedly, I mean, Anne, you know, bless her heart, the way we met, it was through a work colleague. But I know I was going through a bit of a time where I was trying to make a relationship with another girl, and then one evening I got invited to a party, and Anne was there, and I knew instantly that this was. Now again, people say, "Well, that happens to everyone." Yeah, it probably does. But the way that my life was going, I've looked at so many incidents and turned and said, "God was at work there." And you were saying earlier about what would I say to young people, I would say to them, always look for the ways in which God is at work in your life, because he is. So that's, you know, one of the things I feel very deeply.
Absolutely.
60 years and time to hang up your boots.
Well, I was going to ask you, so you know, what's next, Steve? You know, you talked about a continuing journey.
Yeah.
You know, and I've been privileged to sit in many of your services over the years, and to listen to what you have to say and what God is saying through you. You know, is it really time to hang it up, or have you got a few more in you yet?
No, it is very difficult because I've spoken to people about this and said that I've seen preachers who've gone on for too long.
Sure.
You know, and they've done it for the best possible reason, but there comes a point where you ought to look and say, you know, is it time for me to... I don't want people coming up and saying, oh, he used to be good once, but he's no good now and such. And I've had some lovely advice from people. The wife of a minister that I knew, dear friend, died a couple of years back. She wrote to me and she said, there comes a time for not doing, and a time for being. Not doing, give up doing and start being. And I like that. And I went on as well. And there's a word that's been coming to me time and time again in my reading recently and passages. And I preached a sermon on it as well. Encouragement. And one of the things I'm in conference with God about is there a role that I can fulfill by encouraging other people, you know, music groups, other preachers, young people at school. And so I would like, what is it, Barnabas, isn't it, was the great encourager. And there is a passage in Acts where Paul writes and says, you know, if your gift is preaching, then preach. If your gift is and if your gift is encouragement,
encourage.
And I, at this moment in time, I'm looking down those areas where I can become a better encourager. But that's part of the journey.
It is.
That's part of the journey.
It is.
You know.
And a way of continuing to explore what God has in store for you.
Indeed, it goes on.
It does. it's fascinating to hear your insights into what is, you know, a really significant achievement of 60 years. You know, the vast majority of your life thus far in service to God and in service to the church.
Yeah,
You know, so I mean, massive congratulations
thank you.
on the upcoming anniversary, and I hope you're suitably celebrated.
We'll find a way. I'm sure God will find a way.
Yeah, absolutely.